When my grandfather Elias died last year at 88, he left behind a modest but comfortable estate, a paid-off house in a small town outside Asheville, North Carolina, about $200,000 in savings and investments, and a family that had spent the better part of 4 decades pretending I didn't exist in any meaningful way. I want to explain that last part before I get into the will, because none of what happened afterward makes sense without understanding exactly how much of an outsider I'd always been in my own family. My mother, Elias's youngest daughter, had me when she was 19, unmarried, with a man who left before I was born and was never spoken of again. In the world my grandfather came from, old-fashioned, church-going, deeply concerned with appearances, that made me a complication rather than a grandson. My mother passed away when I was 11, cancer, and rather than take me in himself, Elias arranged for me to be raised by my mother's cousin, a kind but distant woman named Patrice, who did her best but was raising 3 kids of her own and never quite had room, financially or emotionally, to make me feel like anything other than an obligation being managed. My aunt and uncle, my mother's older siblings, Deborah and Richard, had their own families, their own kids, cousins I grew up seeing maybe twice a year at holidays, where I was treated with a kind of polite, careful distance that took me well into adulthood to fully name as what it actually was. I was tolerated, not loved, included, not embraced. Elias himself was present in a strange, minimal way throughout my childhood. A card at Christmas with a $20 bill inside, an appearance at my high school graduation where he shook my hand like I was a distant business associate, rather than his own grandson. A general sense that he was fulfilling some technical obligation to my existence without ever actually choosing to be part of my life. I spent a lot of years being angry about that, and a lot more years just being numb to it. The way you get numb to a specific kind of familiar disappointment. When he died, I genuinely wasn't expecting anything from the will, and I want to be honest that I almost didn't attend the reading, held at a lawyer's office in Asheville with my aunt, uncle, their spouses, and 4 cousins present. I went mostly out of a strange, stubborn need to see it through to the end, to witness formally the confirmation of what I'd always known, that I was never really part of this family story. The will divided the house and financial assets evenly among Deborah, Richard, and, to my genuine shock, a smaller but still meaningful share to me, about $30,000, more generosity than I'd braced myself for. But there was an additional clause that confused everyone in the room, myself included. Elias had left me the contents and continued lease, paid up for 1 full year, of a storage unit at a facility about 20 minutes outside town, along with a sealed letter to be opened only by me in private. My Aunt Deborah visibly bristled at this. She asked the lawyer, in a tone that had clearly been simmering for the entire reading, why I was the one being given some mystery storage unit instead of a proper share of the estate like everyone else. The lawyer, a careful older man named Mr. Holloway, who'd apparently handled Elias's affairs for over 20 years, said only that he was instructed to say Elias had his reasons and that they would become clear. I opened the letter alone that night in my car in the parking lot of the storage facility, engine running for the heat, and I still remember my hands shaking as I unfolded it. The letter was short. It said, in Elias's careful, old-fashioned handwriting, "I know I was never the grandfather you deserved, and I know no explanation fixes the years I wasted being ashamed of things that were never yours to be ashamed of. Everything in this unit belongs to you, because it always should have. I'm sorry it took me dying to finally give it to you honestly. Ask Mr. Holloway about the Sutter Ridge property if you want the rest of it. I love you. I always did, even when I was too much of a coward to say it while you could hear me." I sat in that parking lot for a long time before I finally went inside. The storage unit, when I opened it, wasn't full of junk or forgotten furniture the way I'd braced myself for. It was organized, almost curated. Boxes labeled in Elias's handwriting, a small fireproof filing cabinet, and the framed photo I'd never seen before in my life. My mother, maybe 17 years old, standing next to a man who was clearly not a stranger passing through her life, but someone photographed with the easy familiarity of a long relationship. Written on the back in my mother's teenage handwriting was a name: Me and Daddy Wes, summer '89. Not my father, my mother's father. Which meant, if that photo was accurate, Elias, the man whose funeral I just attended, was not actually my biological grandfather at all. The filing cabinet unraveled the rest of it over the following weeks, with help from Mr. Holloway, who, it turned out, had been quietly, carefully assembling this archive alongside Elias for the better part of 2 years before he died, specifically so I would have proof, rather than just the confusing verbal story nobody in the family would ever confirm. My mother, it turned out, was not Elias's biological daughter. She was the product of an affair her mother, my grandmother, who I never met, having died before I was born, had during a difficult period in her marriage to Elias in the late 1960s, with a man named Wesley Ann Tarver, a traveling salesman who apparently visited the area periodically for work. Elias had known, or at least strongly suspected, essentially from the beginning, according to a handful of old letters preserved in the filing cabinet between him and my grandmother. Letters where he grappled, in painfully honest terms, with whether to stay in the marriage and raise a child that wasn't biologically his. He stayed. He raised my mother as his own for her entire childhood, and by every account in those letters, he genuinely came to love her the way any father loves a daughter, biology aside. But the resentment apparently never fully died. It curdled instead over decades into something uglier, a slow burning shame he never resolved, that got redirected, unfairly and cruelly, onto my mother when she became pregnant with me as a teenager, unmarried, echoing in his mind, according to one particularly raw letter to an old friend that Elias had kept a copy of, the same shame that man put on Carol and me 30 years ago, come back around to punish me twice. In other words, my grandfather had spent my entire life treating me like an embarrassing complication, partly because of ordinary, old-fashioned judgment about unmarried teenage mothers, but partly, underneath that, because I was an unwitting, innocent echo of an infidelity that had wounded him decades before I was ever born. None of it was fair to me. None of it was fair to my mother, who Elias, by his own later admission in these letters, had unconsciously punished for a betrayal that was never hers to answer for. The Sutter Ridge property mentioned in his letter turned out to be a small parcel of land, about 11 acres with an old cabin on it, that Elias had quietly purchased and held in a private trust decades earlier, structured specifically to pass to me outside the normal will process, apparently to avoid a fight with Deborah and Richard, who had no idea it existed. Its value, when I eventually had it appraised, came to just over $180,000, more than either of my aunt or uncle's individual share of the official estate. I want to be honest about what I did with all of this, because I think it says more about who I ended up becoming than anything else in this story. I didn't go to Deborah and Richard with the affair letters as some kind of weapon, even though a part of me in the rawest days after finding them wanted to. I didn't need to punish anyone for Elias's decades-old shame. What I did instead was quieter. I met with Mr. Holloway, confirmed the Sutter Ridge Trust was legitimate and unchallengeable, and I kept it. I kept the storage unit's contents, and I wrote my aunt and uncle a short letter of my own, explaining, gently but honestly, what I'd learned, not to hurt them, but because I finally understood that their coldness toward me over the years, while never fully excusable, at least had some root cause I could finally name, instead of just absorbing as evidence of my own unworthiness. Deborah's response was not what I expected. She called me, crying, and told me she'd always sensed something off about how Elias treated my mother compared to her and Richard, something she never had language for until my letter gave her one. She apologized, imperfectly and awkwardly, for years of treating me like an afterthought at family gatherings. Richard, to date, has never responded at all, which I've made a slow, ongoing peace with. I renovated the cabin on the Sutter Ridge land myself over the following year, the same slow, deliberate way I approach most things in my life. It's where I live now. I found out through a genealogy service that Wesley Tarver, my actual biological grandfather, passed away in 2015, but I connected with two of his surviving children, half-aunts I never knew existed, who welcomed me with a warmth that still catches me off guard sometimes. The kind of easy, uncomplicated welcome I spent 30-some years never quite receiving from the family I thought was mine by blood. I don't hate Elias for what it's worth. I've read enough of his own words now, his own decades of quiet self-recrimination in those letters, to understand he was a deeply flawed man, doing his clumsy, delayed best to make something right before he ran out of time to do it. He never said the words to my face while he was alive, but he built me a door out of a storage unit and a trust fund. And in the end, he made sure I'd have the whole truth, instead of just the polite, careful distance I spent my whole life mistaking for the truth. That's more than a lot of people get. I've learned to let it be enough.